and we're trying to build and sustain community. Today's topic is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we've got an agenda that is the typical agenda. Welcome, that's what I'm doing. Wiltz is basically going to manage the entire time. Pete and I are not going to facilitate this. Wiltz is a master facilitator in addition to everything else he does. So he's taking over as soon as I shut up. He's going to set the context, frame the topic. He's got some really good questions and a great process, I think, for helping to guide our discussion. And then Pete and I will come back at the very end and close it out. So Wiltz, how's that for an introduction? Thank you for doing it for us.
That's perfect. That's beautiful. I would say that this is a conversation, which means I can play the role of a little bit of content and a lot of facilitation of allowing us to talk about our different experiences, lived experiences, and examples to make this a rich conversation. So I look forward to it. It's one of these things, as all of you experience, where anytime you're talking about people issues, culture, we all have an opinion. So I think we will, there's no reason that you will be inhibited in adding something to this. So I look forward to your view. Plus, as we get into it, I'm looking to kind of gain some insights, as Larissa, you were giving me on the last call, some of the issues that I'm dealing with, and see what thoughts and opinions and guidance you would provide as we deal with this topic, not only locally, but internationally. So with that in mind, we'll just get started.
Great.
Well, I'm going to introduce a tool called Menti. I see, Colleen, you've used it before, or Bert, some heads going up and down. Okay, so what it is a way for us to get our thoughts, our ideas out quickly and then talk about those. So what I've seen is whether I'm dealing with a group of 5 or 6 people or 2,000, we can have different conversations. And the other thing is we can, at the end of this, have a record of what we comment on. And this, as you know, is being recorded. So you can go and get this video at your leisure. So to kick it off, in your chat, you have this passcode and access. What you're going to do is go to menti.com. You can do that on your computer, your iPad, iPhone, or any other device. Go to menti.com. It's going to ask you for your code, and it's 261848. So the first question, just to make sure we can access it. All right, we got someone who was able to get in and do it. Okay, just
what's the code again, Wilt? Sorry.
It's in the chat, but it's 261840 and 8. So just to see that we can get access to the tool, because we use this through our conversation.
261840.
Yeah, 261848, Bert.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. So how many have used this before? Just give me a hands up. All right. What's been your experience with it? Helpful, not helpful, what?
It's a good energizer.
Yeah, I like polling overall. Sometimes I use like just the Zoom polls. So people have to go out, but Menti or Poll Everywhere I've used as well.
Yeah, yeah. Good, good. So we got 5. Is anyone having trouble accessing the link? Bert, were you able to get in?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm laughing because normally I would choose, I'm the person who chose my mom because I haven't seen my mom in almost a year now, and because of COVID. So I would choose Michelle Obama, but at this stage, I think I'd really like to see my mom.
Yeah.
I also chose my mom, but I don't know why it's not. It's not. Maybe I should type in your mom.
You can also see my mom.
Code
So
your mom is also not found. Look at that. It doesn't want me. Interesting.
Wow, that is interesting.
I'm gonna try again.
There it is.
There it is. I
It's
went
a-
to the website, so I didn't.
Okay.
Got it.
So we all know, been refreshed on how to use the tool. So let's just get into the content of diversity. Okay, good. Everyone's voted. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, like anything else, we look at what's the business case for DE&I. And there are a number of sources, but one I found coming from Deloitte was this multiplier effect for DE&I. Pete, you're shaking your head, so we'll get into that in a moment. But I like to just see what your experience and your thoughts are on what's the business case, not just because some of us may feel it's the right thing to do, especially if you grew up in the era that I grew up in. It's like, how long is this going to take before we just do what's right? But we know, even today, what started in April and May, a lot of effort and impact from companies, individuals all over our country here in the US. We can see pushback already. We can see people deciding or looking at this as, even though it might be the right thing to do, there's no business reason for doing it. So I just like to kind of open up by saying there are reasons, and I like to hear how you address this from both the right thing to do as well as from the business case of doing this. And to kick this off, what are your thoughts? And if you go to the same code, Minty at 261848, what do you see as the reasons for doing diversity, inclusion, and equity? So I'm going to hide that so I can get your thoughts, and then we'll talk about it as a community. Okay. Give us about a minute to do that. I don't know if you all use that little clock, but I like to use it. Keeps me on track. Okay, we've got about 15 more seconds. So then we just want to try to understand your perspective. Good. So we have creativity and innovation, which was one of the points on the previous slide. Okay. Why don't we just open it up? Why did you make the comments you made around any of the points, creativity, innovation, or what's your experience with inclusion making better results?
Wiltz, I'd like to share just a bit of an experience that I had that was my first real cross racial categories experience as a leader, and that was when I was in U.S. Navy boot camp in San Diego, California, and I was made squad leader. One of, I think there were 5 or 6 of us as squad leaders, and majority of the young men that were in my squad were African American, and had 1 Latino in our group, and then a couple of white guys. And our stewardship, each squad had an area of responsibility, and our stewardship were the latrines. And so we were the bathroom cleaners. Not a glamorous job. And when I received that job, it was kind of like, oh dear, how do I harness these crazy sailors who are all so different and so crazy and so wonderful? But it worked. And we all treated each other with respect, and we were able to have the best latrines in the boot camp. Although at one point in time we almost blew the place up because we mixed chlorine bleach with lye, and it produced chlorine gas, and we had to evacuate the barracks. But the reality was that by having that attitude of respect and kindness towards each other and inclusion of each other, we were able to really do good work together. And so I guess that's a productivity kind of measure. And by the way, there was a lot of antagonism racially, and a lot of antagonism between young men from California and young men from Texas. There, I had to step into fights from time to time to break them up. And so that was my personal experience, was you just gotta get everybody involved, listen to everybody's perspective, let everybody make suggestions, and then let's do it. And it worked.
Pete, other experiences around inclusion producing results?
Yeah, I've got a couple, Wilts, but I'll hold off until somebody else speaks, in case they've got something to offer.
Well, I could speak a little bit. This is something that I've been interested in working in for a long, long time. But one piece of it at sort of the micro team level I've noticed is that when people have different communication styles or approaches, sometimes based upon their background, their ethnicity, or their cultural background, their family background, whatever it is, different communication approaches can sometimes, if not, understood or accepted or tolerated, can create conflict. And so one of the aspects of this that I learned a long time ago was to help people begin to appreciate and tolerate differences in communications approaches, because those are sometimes based on that kind of background. So someone, for instance, who's very direct and very, speaks with a loud voice or whatever, compared to someone in the room who's much quieter, maybe more introverted, and sometimes, they don't get along very well. Like that's just a kind of an extreme example, but that's what I'm talking about. So that's an important piece of this big multi-layered puzzle.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I can comment as well. What I have seen is that organizations that focus and make it a part of the conversation, focus on belonging, have an electric atmosphere. And because we all know that performance can be achieved with command and control. You can build mechanisms inside an organization where you don't have a sense of belonging, where you don't have safety, but you have performance. But if you want to tap into genius, into collective genius of many different flavors, I think when you hear the language of belonging, of diversity and inclusion, not so much as a mandate, but as a calling for an organization, I have seen I've stepped into completely different spaces where, for instance, an idea of a type of training or a workshop is embraced and it's funded because it is important to maybe one or two people. And it is given the space to promote learning for others who didn't necessarily think that was a need. That kind of thing has made a huge difference in organizational spaces I have entered. So yeah,
Good.
big
Thank you.
impact.
I
Okay.
just, yeah, I could focus on that perspective and making sure that you have a perspective of others, especially as you're trying to solve problems or improve services. Or just recently, we had a LGBTQ diversity task force and thinking about trans health and what that looks like, and having someone who's actually a trans person describing that experience and being involved in that process of their own insider view of healthcare and translating that and helping the team come up with some innovative ideas to make people feel safe. I mean, that was really important to have all those voices of different represented groups in healthcare, I think.
That's an excellent example, Colleen, in that many times we don't think about how that diversity can be tapped into versus shut down to come up with not only design outside the box, but designing a new box. I mean, they think, when I say they, people with different diverse backgrounds just see a whole different possibility than those of us who are in the game that we're playing. So thank you. Bert?
Well, in the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years, 2 experiences I've had really have heightened this sensitivity for me. One of those are, and you'll be familiar with some of this. One is the work of the United Food, the farm workers in the EFI project that the Roundtable has been involved with for now at least 5 years. And the other is my experience working with projects in Northern Canada, Northern British Columbia, that in our Canadian environment involve the issue of Indigenous people being effectively participants in economic projects. And the 2 things that I've seen really strongly, I'll deal with the Indigenous first because it's a bit maybe unique for you as Americans. But by really meaningfully listening to how Native people look at work, I've seen projects being able to operate in a totally different way. For example, amongst the Native people, they want access to a lot of the equipment on the weekends so they can use that in their community. And employers have to open up to that whole different way of using property, which is a cultural, a different cultural way of looking at enterprise. So it ends up that these projects operate differently than they normally would if they were run simply by white Anglo-Saxons. And until the white Anglo-Saxons are willing to operate in these different ways, they can't really function that effectively. But they come up with some really creative ideas. And the other thing that echoes what Larissa was saying, I think with the United Farm Workers, once the participation valves were opened with the berry workers and the harvesters themselves, so that they could become more directly involved in the operation of harvesting, a whole different set of solutions arose as to how to handle certain hygiene problems and so forth. And why I think the inclusive issue is actually pretty significant in both these cases is that much of what is done on the, if you like, the absolute front line of many of our work processes in North America involve people who are not in the mainstream of our culture. They may be Black, they may be indigenous, they may be Mexican, whatever. Whereas these enterprises are run by people of a different color and a different culture. So unless we tap into these frontline cultures more effectively, I don't think our operations will be that effective.
If I may, I could add to what Bert just said about the farm workers, because I've been the consultant to the Equitable Food Initiative for the last 7 years. And one of the growers, Vic Smith, he is a grower, he has farms in Arizona, California, and Mexico, has said that how surprised he was by the new solutions that farm workers came up with. Some really practical solutions he had early on when they first started working with the Equitable Food Initiative. They were trying to figure out scheduling around holidays, particularly the Christmas holiday. And farm workers didn't want to work on Christmas Day, but just happened to be when one of the farms needed to be harvested. I think it was one of his onion farms, and they just couldn't get enough people to work. With EFI, they had that problem. They discussed that problem with the leadership team, which consists of farm workers and managers together. And they came up with, I don't remember what it was, but they came up with a solution that worked for everybody. And he was just blown away because it just solved a huge productivity issue for him around that time of year. And then recently he met with the leadership team, which has been now working for, I think, a couple of years. It's the first time, and he's the owner of the company, right? So it's the first time he met directly face-to-face with the team. And again, he was blown away by their insights, their contributions, their willingness to problem solve, and the quality of the ideas they came up with. And now he has committed to them that he will meet with them at least quarterly. And he's just opening up, the rest of his management culture to being open and responsive to this team even more than before.
But it does require, I think, an openness on the part of the other party to accept these non-traditional solutions that often come up.
Yeah.
For example, in the indigenous situation I described with these economic projects, and you mentioned a little bit with the the United Farm Workers as well, is that, for example, the workers wanted an arrangement whereby when Johnny wants to go fishing, Billy can come in and fill for him. And the employer had to sort of trust that that would work. And they had to develop arrangements that would make it work. But that was not the way people were normally employed in these projects.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Okay.
Well, and I will say too, sorry, that not just Vic Smith, the example I just spoke about, but several other growers have said that once they started working within the EFI sort of worker development and worker participation model, they actually had to literally fire some of their middle and upper level managers who could not or would not switch to this new way of working with people. And they had to hire new people. So within the industry, now I'm just going to a macro level, within the industry, there is actually a gap of people who can lead and manage in a participative way rather than a command and control way, which is traditionally how agriculture has worked. So there's lots of opportunity there for that to happen.
Yeah, Gada, I just wanted to say to that point, I think DEI initiatives marry really well with building cultural competency, where you're expanding the view of how you do business from procedural centered to relational. And like in Canada, as Bert is saying, there's a beautiful and incipient effort in building cultural competency around Indigenous relations. We're learning so much from how you bring in profitability and all of those things by really just opening up your processes and allowing for some flexibility, for trust to lead the way. right? Like what Bert was just talking about, can Johnny take over this weekend? Like that would never happen in our mainstream culture, but it is the way into many communities, indigenous communities, immigrant communities. I worked for a safety organization where really the fact that you have to have your boiler checked meant nothing to indigenous communities or to some immigrant communities. So they wouldn't, and they would hide it. And lo and behold, you have an accident because you have not promoted the importance of what you are doing in a way that makes sense to these communities who are, you know, making a fire inside of their homes instead of, you know, that's the means that they live by. So really understanding how other communities live and think about the world is so critical to businesses really living their full mandate. And sometimes the equation doesn't quite fit the thinking model that they need, like the profitability plus. It's much more, I'm taking too long. It's much more intangible and much more powerful at the same time.
Yeah, I want to build on that up until, let's say, the last 5 years, we didn't have scorecards that focused on the social economy and the value of the social economy in terms of the value of the brand. And companies who have a brand, what is that worth to the marketplace? Now we do. We have a different set of metrics that we could use. And what I find is that we don't take time to introduce those new metrics to the new scorecard, and we don't keep those scorecards so that we can end up at the end of the day saying DE&I is good for business. We have a lot of data that shows that, but trying to get, especially those who are in power, to understand, which is kind of the core to what we do around where people are and participation and so forth, but that shifting that power, building, as you said, the respect, the trust, the relationship, and using a different scorecard that we'll get into more in a moment. But if we started to do that, what it would open up for us when they see that this is really good for business. You're not just doing it because it's the right thing to do. That's the ice on the cake.
You know, Wiltz, your little chart that you showed, that first one with, I think you said it was a Deloitte study.
Yes.
And the multiplier numbers, that really struck me. I mean, those are terribly astonishing numbers. You know, when you think about.
And we have the data, though. We have the data to prove that now.
Yeah.
I mean, not only here in the U.S., in Canada, in other places in the world, we have there not only Deloitte, but there are other companies who are doing these studies, not the big five, who've proven that you can get these kinds of results. And first you go through, like anything else, there's the denial. No, that's not why. But as you have spoken to, you start digging into it and you see these pockets of excellence. I mean, you think about where we see all over the world, like micro lending. That would have never come from mainstream, right? Never would have come from mainstream. What you were saying about looking at trust in terms of using tools and equipment other than being on the job. I work with a client right down here in Gainesville, Florida, a lid manufacturing plant. And they had two rules: don't lie, don't steal, right? So you could take the equipment, tools, go home, work on your car, do whatever you want to do. But at the end of the day, it needed to be where it needed to be so that they could keep the line running. As long as that was done, do what you had to do. Now, what we don't see is those kinds of, oh, that's the exception. We can't do it here. You know, not working through some of that. So we'll get a little bit deeper into it as we discuss, but I really want to, I really appreciate some of those experiences that you have discuss, and that there is a tremendous amount. And we look at today, one of the biggest barriers we are facing in productivity is innovation, right? And we don't want to use the people we have to help us with that innovation. We don't think they're either capable or whatever the reasons are, but we don't do that. Okay, let's move on a little bit. We're all familiar with this, right? Some form of a model that we use to customize to design high-performing organizations. And those of you who know me, I come out of design-based, so most of mine is organizations are perfectly designed to get the results they get. And if you're not getting results, go back to the design. What is it, either in your thinking or your approach, that is producing the results that you're getting? So with this model in mind, or your own model for looking at systems design, I want to ask you this question, and that is, where is the leverage? We talk about leverage. Where is the leverage in the systems model for building a sustainable DE&I culture? Where would you think it would be? Is it focusing on values and goals and strategy around the right thing to do, the design elements, the business case for change, all of the above, or something else? So both. Okay.
I'm behind.
I cannot figure out how to vote.
Oh,
I can't figure out how to vote. I can't figure out how to vote.
I had to go to the go to slide button on top and then make a choice and then go down to the bottom to submit.
See that, Elizabeth?
I'm not sure that I do. I'm sorry, I don't. I don't. Oh, I see. Go. Okay, never mind. I do now. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so most of us feel that it's all of the above. Good systems thinkers. Okay, I'm interested in something else. What else might it be? If not looking at this from a systems approach, what are we missing in our design process?
I'm the odd one out.
All right, we're here to learn something.
You know,
What's missing?
living diversity right here. It's not that I don't agree with everything that's on the list and would choose all of the above, but I think that my experience and kind of almost my conviction is that what is missing is leveraging leadership. And leveraging leadership impacts everything that is part of the design of the organization. And it is through fully holding leaders accountable as part of their performance for DEI behaviors and DEI leadership styles that you are going to have an impact. And you're going to be, because they're gatekeepers, usually. What is below them stops with them or gets amplified. It is really kind of that very big structural piece that can suppress or, as I said, amplify. So that's the reason I chose something
That's
else.
a very good reason, and it is a call out. I totally agree and support what you're saying. It doesn't show up in this model. In your models, it may show up, but the point that you're making is I'm totally in agreement with that.
Me too.
Anything else
No.
you would add? Elizabeth, like you're saying something there.
No, I totally agree with Larissa, but the way I look at this model, Larissa, I saw leadership in the values and operating principles. I think it's totally embedded in the leaders. And they really, I mean, we're living it in the United States at the moment. With a leader that has very different values, and at least we do, I'll say. and see how it's playing out.
Well,
I
and
think one of the points that we could say is that because of what we're trying to do in this space, maybe we need to call it out even more explicitly. So
Possibly.
I would advocate for that just because at this point, you very often see values printed on the stationery and on the walls and doors of organizations on their signature, but there is no accountability for living out the values. There isn't really, so when you think about leadership structure and what they are incentivized to do, they're incentivized to sort of like show that the status quo works really, really well. Like what we decided we were going to do is giving us the results. That frame and that mental model doesn't really allow for disruption, because disruption is what you get with diversity and inclusion quite often. But if the leadership mandate is to go from A to B with 100% speed and amplifying the revenues and all of that, they can't afford to have disruption. So you can see, I know I'm simplifying something quite complex, but that's just the gist of what I'm really feeling strongly about. Sorry.
No, this is good. So, and I agree with you a lot, Larissa, because I have been working with an organization, actually not the only one, but in recent times, I worked with an organization in which the top leader said that she wanted to change the culture to become more inclusive and, all these things. And so I began talking with her about what that meant for her to want to, because her team, her senior leadership team, wasn't on board with her. This was her vision and her idea. And I began talking with her what that would mean for her role as a leader in the organization and the need for her to really champion it, and particularly to help her senior leadership team get on board and then hold their feet to the fire and all the different pieces that go with that, as well as working from the bottom of the organization up and in between. And she dropped the ball, right? So, this is really proving your point. She dropped the ball. She wanted this to happen. She got busy. Other business priorities took over. She, we'd started setting up teams to begin across the organization, up and down and across the organization, to start working on issues. And she dropped the ball in terms of holding particularly her senior leadership team's feet to the fire. And they undermined the process. Like we had to go back to ground zero. It was that impactful, her ability not to stay with it.
So Larissa, you made me think of something that maybe doesn't show up on that chart, Wiltz. I'm not sure. It's similar to what you're saying, Larissa, but when I think of what's happened with the UFW and the Equitable Food Initiative, and what I think what's happened in some of these indigenous or northern environment projects that I work with, I think one of the keys has been what I would call trust between the, if you like, the official leadership and the voice for inclusion. In the EFI situation, I think in many cases, not very much would have happened unless the leadership at the UFW, and particularly people like Eric Yagara, had been able to develop the trust of people like Ernie and the enterprise owners. And without that trust, I don't think a lot of these other things like business case and all that would have really been opened up. That's my hunch.
Yeah.
When I think of some of the work with these indigenous projects, it's taken quite a long time to get to this state where we can actually innovate, because there's a trust building process here that takes time. Some of these indigenous leaders have had to travel in the shoes of some of these white folks, and the white folks have had to travel in the shoes of the indigenous folks before they could actually talk about doing something, operating in a different mode. All the efforts that I may have brought in terms of talking about the business case and the values has kind of hung around until this trust could be opened up. Anyway, I just offer that as an adjunct of some of your thoughts about leadership, Larissa.
Can I add on to both of your comments? This morning, I'm working with the chair of a board of a great big foundation in California who is espousing trying to move to a higher engagement with this board and involving them on decisions. Heretofore, it's a family foundation, and it was his father and then him. Enormous responsibility, I'm going to say, for the name of the organization, and not really knowing how to do it different, but espouse theory versus what he's doing. And an example of values and trust, it's not just even, but for him to really look really deeply at himself and what he says he wants, and then his actions. So an example is, there was in Black Lives Matter, foundations all over the United States, probably the world, came out with letters of support, right, for Black Lives Matter and what's happening in, at least in the United States. And his organization wanted to draft, well, there was another organization in San Francisco that drafted a letter, and they wanted these big foundations to sign on. And he was signing on without any conversation with his board. But then he decided he didn't want to sign on for a variety of reasons. And in my conversation, he said, and I've talked to the board. And I said, well, who, because I've worked with the board, who have you talked to on the board? He had talked to the white guys on the board. He had 2 African-American members that he had not called. And when I raised, I said, well, what about so-and-so and so-and-so? Why have you not talked to them? Or what's got you not? He said, and I think he's very sincere. It was like, oh my God, I didn't even see my blind spot. Of course I need to do that. But I think, going back to what you're saying, I think it is trust with others, but to get the trust with others, you really have to go deep and really look at what you're doing and ask yourself all the time, is my behavior, you have to catch yourself. And it's hard to do that. And it was a very dramatic moment, just very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add one other thing in the EFI case. It took a long time to build trust also. One of the ways that they did it was to allow themselves to have conflict. So we don't talk about that very much, but one of the ways to build trust is to succeed at working through the differences that people have, to have the experience of, I can have a different point of view, a completely different worldview, a completely different way of wanting to approach something, a different agenda or a need than you have, or an interest than you have. And when we put all of that on the table and we talk it through, without judging each other for those differences or how we've approached meeting our goals in the past, then we start to build trust. And that's what the EFI, as they were developing the standard, they had to work through all of that. And it's a multi-stakeholder board, right? So it's not just growers and farm worker representatives, it's other interests at the table too, and they all had to do that. And so their willingness to be open and honest and really be willing to talk through those differences, and not always in, I will say, not always in a, they were always civil, but not always, like they would raise their voices, right? They would, you don't always have to be nice in order to get through that sometimes. And I think that's sometimes an Anglo-Saxon expectation that, one, you want to minimize conflict, and two, if you do have it, certainly be nice about how you talk with each other about it. And that's not how it always works when you get a diversity of people in the room.
Right.
Can I add something, Wiltz? I think the points that are being made are absolutely wonderful. And I've had a personal case around blind spots and conflict and all that. My daughter, Claire, is married to Haitian, and he's very dark skinned. And he grew up in Florida, so he's very, very westernized, has a master's degree. He's just a wonderful guy. But when the Black Lives Matter, well, it's the George Floyd murder, when that broke loose, and Breonna, when she was murdered, my daughter and I had a conversation, and and we all love my grandchildren, Sophie and Braxton, who are brown babies, and the interaction with them is good, aunt and uncle and grandfather and grandmother kind of behavior. But what Claire said to me was, Dad, you don't understand it from Bradford, her husband's perspective as a Black man. And you don't understand it from my perspective as the mother of brown children and as the wife of a Black man. She said, because I fear for what is going to happen potentially with my children and with my husband. And that led to a lot of pushing and demanding. And she's had the conversation with all of us in the family of, you guys have to take this seriously because you have skin in the game. You are a part of the problem and you're part of the solution. And oh, by the way, it has a direct effect on your son-in-law and your grandchildren. So Dad, you need to think about this really differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to tie what you said, is when we say good for business, I don't mean that in the classical sense of business case. I mean, it's good because what you just said, when you look at generations, that's a business case for me that we don't talk about. Take the word business off of it, whatever word, but we don't talk enough about why we need to be doing this. What the impact is going to be and what we need to do. And that's a very good point that we need to dig in a little bit more as we first add something before we move on. Did I see your finger go up, Larissa? Oh, maybe not. Okay.
I was just scratching my forehead, but I could add something. I've been reflecting on the model you put up, and I do think that if you want to work with that model, the layer of was it rewards, I believe, goals and performance metrics.
Yeah.
The question that I ask here in the organization is, what do you tolerate and what do you celebrate? Because to Yagada's point, for example, if you say we celebrate conflict, and this is how you approach, this becomes part of the ethos of leadership, then it does allow, it builds a culture around we can have divergent perspectives. Moreover, if you say our performance metrics include how you interact with your teams and how many ideas do you harvest in any one meeting that you're leading? What do you walk out of that you didn't have walking in? So you can include what I said earlier as a leadership umbrella into the metrics to say, yeah, sure, all of this like philosophy around DEI is great, but how do we include that in what we reward?
Yeah.
In the organization.
Please build on that word.
Because and this ties directly, I think, with the notion of building trust. If people see that there is an actual tangible value in the organization that holds people accountable, then they begin to trust that that's a real thing, that inclusion is a real thing. Just a suggestion.
No, that's all right. And one thing I want to add to this that all of you know is when we look at the different elements, whether they're at the top or in the middle, it's about the fit, right? And we don't, many times, and I would ask this question now, we get to it a little bit later. One of the reasons that I highlighted the red is if you look at the interventions, the initiatives that are started, especially across the US, they're all, I'll say all, predominantly aimed at building competency, building skills, especially with those who have blind spots. Now, what does that tell us if we only focus on that element?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand, Wilt.
Okay, give you an example. Our president, not your president, our president just raised the flag and said, no more sensitivity training,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
If we focus, if we, given our practice and our mindset around design, focus in and support only one element of this, what's the consequence we know is going to happen? What would you predict the result's going to be?
Failure?
Right. It's going to be failure.
Failure?
Status quo.
Yes.
Chaos.
But how much have you seen in the last 6 months only focuses on one element?
Wilt, are you talking about the nation? One element that we're focusing on in the nation or in
Yeah.
our?
Yeah, if we look at across the country, you see more training, whether it's allyship, whether it's diversity, D&I, whatever, you see more courses now, more webinars, more. Everywhere you pick up YouTube, you look at Facebook, somebody is offering LinkedIn something on DE&I to build competency. And to me, it's criminal. Because we went through this in the 60s and 70s. The same strategy we went through in the 60s and 70s, and we're back 40 years now dealing with it again, as if we didn't learn anything. So I'm preaching to the choir, but I just wanted to make that point that we know better. I wanted to throw this framework up just to get your thoughts. So look through it. Tell me what you think about this notion of D&I as a multiplier. So I'm going to go to the question here of what are some examples and experiences you have. It could be a multiplier. We're going to talk about those, share those. And I'll put this back up. But the question is, what are some of your lived experiences that say we can add more to what Covey said and more to what Drucker said by looking at DE&I as a multiplier, where it's not as a liability, but it's an asset. And I would say right now, most people start off thinking about this as something else to add to my already 120-hour week.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you look at that in terms of this as a multiplier? And as you were thinking about it, Pam, you and I talked about this a little bit with the experience you have, and I think it'd be good to share that lived experience and get into this conversation if you don't mind.
Okay, let's see if I can be coherent about it. I have a client who is struggling in the organization that he heads to really build DE&I into everything he's doing, from going back and looking at strategies, strategic plan, mission, vision, to how roles are defined. And he is, 50-ish and white and recognizes that and acknowledges that and knows that he doesn't have the answers, which is really good. I mean, and he's bringing board members who are quite diverse and other members of other stakeholders in to help him and his staff think through that. He has a young woman who's 30-ish, who is on his staff. She's one of the managers, and she thinks she gets it. You know, she's there, and she is white, does not have a lot of experience with other organizations, but she knows, you know, what DE&I should look like and is, and it's been interesting to watch the two of them. She believes that her lived experience is in a world where you know, DE&I doesn't exist, no one else is paying attention to it, and she can't get on board with where the other leaders in the organization are going. So while there's an organizational plan being developed to move forward, and the leader is developing a personal plan to move forward, she's kind of dug her heels in and said, I don't need this, I'm there. And I get it, and the rest of you don't. So it's interesting, and she's blocking at this point, and they're gonna have to deal with that, and just can't see it. And he's trying to find workarounds. How does he deal with this?
Well, she can't see herself if she claims that I'm there. Okay, help us get there.
Yeah. I mean, that, and so far that's not working very well. But yeah, it's an interesting conundrum when you have someone who believes you're there, so you therefore believe she is there and no one else is, when in fact her behavior suggests she doesn't get it. And her boss is trying to use DEI as really as a multiplier, as Wiltz is suggesting. And Wiltz, in that conversation, you made an observation that I credit you all the time, but you made an observation that made such sense to me about the folks who are really going to succeed at this are the ones who are building DEI into the DNA of their organizations. And that's what this client of mine is trying to do. And it's messy and it's complicated, and he knows he's probably going to make mistakes along the way, and he's willing to apologize for those, but he's not willing to sit still and say, okay, we've done enough. So, changing DNA is tough.
Yes. Yeah, changing culture is tough in DNA, right?
Yeah.
Let me just do a sound check. I got some feedback that it wasn't working. Is it better through this headset or the same?
It's
I think
better
it's
for
a little
me.
bit better.
Better? Okay. Okay, some other experiences, examples of where you see DE&I as a multiplier. And before you answer that, let me just add from a STS standpoint of why I focus on this area, and that is, we all know about variance analysis, right? And key variances and the importance of talking in the language of the throughput. The language of business is what? P&L.
Yeah.
Right? Business case. So one of the reasons you see this context or flavor here is, I think my bias is for, just like we were talking earlier, well, as indigenous people, someone from a different culture, we have to speak their language, and their language is P&L. So when we can talk in terms of the business case and the multiplier and how innovation and agility and all that can be accomplished through DE&I, because they have this asset, but they don't look at it as an asset.
Mhm.
On their balance sheet, if they were to talk about the balance sheet, they would put everything with DE&I on the liability side, on the cost side, on the expense side. So you got to go to them like with a cup, asking for funds or support to do it. So you see what I'm getting at? How do we change the language? How do we change the conversation so that they know we're talking their language? And if they don't do this, whoever their competitor is who does is going to beat them. That's my take on all of this.
So Wills, that clarifies it more for me, I have to say. I think what you want to do is have a data-driven conversation. So what is the data that they are working with? And if they don't have enough HR data, engagement data, that is telling them what their workforce is doing and how they're doing it, or what they are not doing, then that is a place to start. Because in a process consultation approach, even if it's a light touch process consultation, you might be able to get them to realize that that is what they need. That what is it that we don't know? What is it that we don't have visibility into? And it may be we don't have visibility into our human asset, for example, or we only have balance sheets and profit and loss analysis, but we don't really have visibility into what we're getting out of our human capital. And you can use like that business terminology. That's where you need to start with organizations that where a business case has no place to grow almost. It sounds to me like it's so alien to them. If they're only thinking strategy, inputs, outputs, they don't really have a people-centered strategy. Then you need to meet them where they're at, and that is that data. That is that data, and you can say, it's interesting. This is the data we're looking at. I'm wondering what is it we are not actually seeing on this report. What are the data points that we are missing?
Very good point, and you know, I'll come back to that.
And Wiltz, I have a question too about so
Speak
power and
up just a
control.
little bit.
Can you hear me?
Did you speak up just? Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. I have a question about power and control. Larissa
Yes.
said earlier that you can get performance and results in a command and control type approach. And so I'm harking back to that example I gave about the leader who sort of dropped the ball because then her senior leadership team didn't want to let go of the power they perceived they had. They didn't understand that, in fact, by sharing power, they would increase their own power. They didn't get that concept,
Right.
Hadn't witnessed it or experienced it. And so I guess I would ask, where would that fit in here? And how would you talk about that in terms of using language that people can understand?
Very good question. Before I give my opinion, any other thoughts on power and control? Your experiences with power and control?
I worry that many of us as leaders and many of our clients as leaders have these blind spots that lead us to not understand the cause-effect relationships that are inherent in the DE&I set of issues. So our model of profit and loss, our model of progress as a business or as an institution excludes any of the measures of the reality that lives in our blind spots. And so it's, so those of us in power will tend to only operate off of what we see and know. And so we'll totally exclude this stuff that has a powerful, to us invisible, impact on the business results we cherish most as profit increase, expense decrease, etc. So it comes back to my blind spot that my daughter was talking to me about. Dad?
But this is I see this as such a beautiful link between the micro and the macro, right? Exclusion of data, exclusion of information. What is it we're not seeing? Is so akin to what diversity and inclusion is all about. Who are we not hearing from? What are we not paying attention to? What voices are we ignoring and suppressing? What opportunities for bringing in new ideas are we missing out on? It's a similar, you see, like the system is all revealing itself, you know, through our mindsets, really, in a way. I don't know if that makes any sense, but, and the question critical to this becomes, what is it that we are not paying attention to?
Very true. You know, I want to go back to or elaborate a little bit more. One of my clients, kind of like his aha moment was conversation he and I were having about he's grown up and lived a pretty privileged life, and what that meant to him when he thought about it was being in a position of power, but now professing as an individual in an organization, in that they were going to be about the inverted pyramid. So that was a nice way of putting like you said, putting a diagram on a wall and saying our customer is here and here we are and we're in support. But they didn't go to the question of what does that mean about power? Where is the power now in terms of serving that customer? Is that power now that the people here who are touching the customer are going to have the power to make a decision to give that customer what they need, or do we have to go back to them to get that information? And they know, I mean, the good thing is most of these people, these leaders, didn't get there because they weren't smart. They are very smart.
Yeah.
The question is, can we give them and talk to them in their language with data that helps them to see what they don't know and they can't see right now? And one, for instance, in this case, once he started to reflect and realize that he wasn't congruent between what he was saying and what he was doing, now he's committed to, as Pete said, living in that experience with his daughter and son-in-law, to what is that like? You know, what is it of having that conversation with your brown grandkids that you would never have to have with anyone else, right? So understanding that power is good if it's in the place where it needs to be in order to make the business as well as the culture what you want it to be.
Servant leadership. I think it's, who is it that talks about
Well, the
it?
only thing I would challenge you on, and I think we will agree, is that when we talk about leader and leadership, they're not the same. So the leader does not have to be the one where the leadership is. The leadership could come from that indigenous person or that group or whomever that has the knowledge and the content to help us get to where we're trying to go. It doesn't have to be at this little apex at the top of the bottom of the pyramid. And once we, again, mindset, start to buy into that, what we really mean by leadership versus the leader, and the accountability for what, as we do in our practices, then we start seeing some possibility for moving it to the DNA.
You know, my boot camp experience, Wiltz, was really interesting because in order for us to really keep the latrines clean,
Mm-hmm.
it couldn't be on my shoulders because, you know, each one of us used the restroom, and kind of the mantra that we got was every time any one of us uses the restroom, we're responsible for kind of policing the area.
Right.
Paper towel on the floor, we'd pick it up and put it away. If somebody dribbled on the floor, we'd clean it up. And so we had to get to the point that everybody on the team, regardless of which person it was or what their background or race or whatever, that all of us as the team had to be making that effort. And it wasn't on me as a squad leader, it was on us as a team. But that buy-in from them, they had to know that they were a loved, cherished, and important member, contributing member of that team in order to do that.
I want to go to Larissa, your point around getting the data and the information. And one of the things that you're probably familiar with is the IDI. It's a global survey that's used to help people understand where they are on this continuum from a ethnocentric to ethno-relative stage. And one of the things that it does, especially with the leadership, the top leaders of an organization, it helps them to not only understand where they are, but also where they may choose to go to. And by helping them to see that, then they start developing their own individual development plan and team plan, then organizational plan. Let's say that if their defense is kind of the same as polarization, that is my way or the highway, I'm the dominant culture, so anything else I don't see, or minimization or acceptance, most times their perception is that they're much further on this continuum than they are. They would like to say, I'm at acceptance or adaptation. And when they get the survey back and they find out, oh, I'm at polarization or denial, then they say, well, that dissonance kind of creates a tension that says, I want to do something about that. I don't want to be perceived as being in denial, right? Or being polarized, that I don't see the value of others. So they're willing to, and Pam asked me an interesting question, said, do the terms here create resistance? And I've used this around the world, and I haven't found the resistance in the survey when they do it. I found the resistance in the beginning around, it's not going to tell me anything, or I could manipulate the answers, something like that. So typical survey kind of pushback. But this is one tool that I use, I wanted to share for how do you get that baseline data. So you have the employee survey, right? You have the information from Glassdoor and all of that data. But one thing we don't have is data around where we are around cultural competency. This gives us one way of starting to determine that baseline, that then we can set some goals to do something if we want to.
This really resonated with me, Wiltz, when you showed it to me the other day. And in the client example I was trying to be coherent about earlier, what struck me was the young woman, the young manager, is probably somewhere in the ethnocentric stages in reality, probably between defensiveness, polarization and this minimalization stage. And in fact, she believes that she's at integration.
Right.
And she believes the organization is back at minimalization or defensiveness, and the leader is probably the CEO is probably at the acceptance stage and trying to figure out how to get the entire organization there so it can move forward. So this was helpful to me in just thinking about where are people and where are organizations. But I had to remove the value judgment from it in order to use it.
Yeah.
Is it a self-assessment, which I can't imagine is very effective, or is it feedback?
It's a self-assessment at an individual level. It's also done in group. It's pretty much like a DISC survey. You know, if you would think of it that way, you do your individual, then your group profile, then you look at it and you determine where are the areas for development, individually, group, and organizationally. And,
Yeah, I haven't used this model, Wilts. What I have used is the Global Diversity and Inclusion metric, I think, DGIB or something. Yeah.
Very similar, yeah.
Except for the fact that it includes equity-seeking groups. So there's a place to identify whether there's norms around gender, around language, around almost every type of minority, if you will, that we are aware of that actually has an impact. And how many employees are actually seeking an equity group. So how many employees feel on the fringe, essentially, not belonging in the mainstream of the organization. So it gives a broader perspective outside of just the cultural, ethno-cultural dynamic, but also into like human rights and policy do people with kids have a place in this organization? It gets very granular. Actually, I think there's about 15 different categories. So within every category, you've got layers and layers of metrics. It's quite comprehensive and it's daunting to work with it, but it is really, I would say, the closest I've seen to a 360 understanding of culture through metrics. And of course, we also did interviews and focus groups to supplement that.
Okay, great. I see we're running tight on our time here. This is just a framework for a roadmap. I'm not going to spend time on this. I did have one other question, though. We've kind of talked about it, but I'd like to get your comments on this one. So we would have just, as I look back on this, I can learn from. So what are your thoughts around why these efforts haven't been sustainable and why it looks like history is repeating itself?
Are we using Menti for this?
Yes, please.
Okay.
You can talk, but I'd like to capture your thoughts. So this is kind of like a word cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're seeing things come up, just feel free to talk about them.
Hard to do a single word, Wilts.
Yeah, okay. I'll take that into consideration the next time. Yes, definitely true.
Yeah.
Anything anyone want to elaborate on in terms of why we don't see it as more sustainable? Yes, Pete?
I had an incident in the military where a friend, colleague who was African American was threatened and attacked by one of my other colleagues who was white and from the South. And I when I walked away from that whole thing after we had kind of gotten it settled down, the thing that came to me was that the white guy was acting out of history and where he had come from and the environment and culture that he is saturated in, but that the real underlying emotion was fear. Even though the black guy, John, was not threatening in any way, shape, or form, just the very existence of John in our group eating lunch with us was a threat to this white sailor.
Yep.
And that was the first time I had ever directly experienced it, and it was astonishing to me.
You know, I have a hope in that the young people are very different. You know, at least on the coast, right? If you watch the Coastal Elites, if you watch that HBO show, it's very cute. The young people in that I'm dealing with, they're everything. They're diversity to the max in every single dimension other than age, because they're young. They have a very different relationship to this issue. They're at the far end of your continuum. I can't say every one of them, right? But the majority that I'm dealing with, that I live with, that I see are. And to some extent, just like the chair of the board that I mentioned, you know, deeply subconscious, I'm guessing, but to not see that on the issue that he needed most to get the opinion of people of color, that he didn't dial them up, was astounding to me. Absolutely astounding. And I'll give it to him that it was an oversight, but it's deeply subconscious. There was a threat for him because they weren't going to agree with him. And I think somewhere he knew that. So fear of then what do I do? I'm not going to get my way. I'm going to be challenged. But the young people are there. So it may be, and I totally agree with you, Wilt, you know, this is a huge effort of ours, probably all of us in the 60s and the 70s. I remember at HP, well, we just need to get women engineers. We don't have any women in leadership because we just need to recruit women engineers. Well, you know, excuse my language, but come on. You know, we are 40 years later, 50 years later, and we're still having the same conversation in some of those organizations. That gets really old, really, really old. And it's white boys. It's not women. It is white guys that are not interested, in my perspective, not interested. And they probably don't have to do it until they're out of business or they've retired. And then they may never have to do it.
Yep.
You know, but the young people coming behind us are quite different.
Well, I would add two things to that. One is it also plays into why it's important to have that business case, because they can always go and say there are only X% of women engineers graduating, there are this many companies, they can play the numbers. So you have to be able to play the numbers to them to show them how to do it, and then blow that argument away. And there are plenty of data, plenty of companies who figured that out. The other side of that is we have to be aware. Again, I'm in that situation where I have black kids and brown kids and white kids. And I got to have a conversation with the ones who are starting to drive. I have one that's getting his license.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's a black kid.
Right.
And the conversation I'm having with him has to do with, what do you do when you are stopped? Where do you put your hands? What do you say? I don't need to have that same conversation with his brother.
Exactly.
right?
Yes, and it's horrifying.
Right. Now, the problem is, even though I would like them to have this brain of equity inclusion, after a while, that mindset that I'm passing on for safety reasons is going to perpetuate
Yep.
what we have. So how do we change the script? And I know, Pam, we'll run out of time. It is time at 2:30, right? 1:30.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it back to you, but thanks so much for allowing me to do this and for your participation and for the results that you put up in the Menti. It will help me. So thank you, Pete
Hey, Will.
and Pam, and thank you, SDS.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, these conversations are really critical. We've scratched the surface. I really appreciated the guidance and the questions you put up and the fact that we got to cover a pretty broad range of territory. It's clear to me we need to have another one of these conversations. And I think we can make that happen down the road. So thanks everybody for being here. I want to remind you, we have another water cooler scheduled on Thursday, November 20th. And we'll send out an announcement in another week or two about what that topic's going to be. In the meantime, if any of you are interested in leading a session, let me know or let Pete know. And we'd love to have you do that. And if you have ideas for topics, please let me know so that we can continue to move forward with this. Again, Wiltz, thank you so much. Really appreciated your efforts at pulling this together. Pete, do you have anything to add here?
I would like to add this. I love you guys. It's really great to be together and to be in conversation about critical issues. And as the emperor, president, or whatever I am of the Roundtable, I would like to also declare that I am an old white man and that I am naive, I have blind spots, and I am without direct experience. As someone who is younger, as someone who is female, as someone who is African American or Latino, I ain't been none of those things. And one of the things that we have discussed for many years in the Roundtable is that it tends to be an old white man's club. And we need to change that. And so I see my job as the leader of the Roundtable to put me out of business, so to speak, and to replace me by somebody who is not an old white male. And so that's one of the challenges that I've presented to the stewards team. How do we develop younger, non-male, non-white membership and leadership in the Roundtable? And I see so many frightening challenges lying ahead for us in the post-COVID or in the midst of COVID world in terms of organization design. And we need people of all stripes and shades and backgrounds and perspectives involved in designing organizations. So Wiltz, I thank you for this because I see this as an extraordinarily relevant issue for us as a Roundtable and for all of our client organizations that we have stewardship for helping to make the journey through these difficult topics.
I have a technical question. Wiltz, do you know how to save the recording?
I just stopped it and it's saved to the STS cloud.
Okay,